Blackballed, 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 Blackballed.
You know, one of the common things across these groups, and what sort of allows them to be labeled a cult, you can easily see that there are these patterns of behavior and patterns of the kinds of rules and norms, and each group might call it something different, but in its essence, it's there to achieve a certain thing, which is the conformity and the obedience. So they will use what I call high arousal techniques. And this may be a certain type of meditation that's very forceful. It may be certain kinds of body movements that keep the person aroused. So one effect of that is that it exhausts you, but also it keeps you from being able to think straight. I mean, how can you possibly think when for hours on end you're doing this, or you're shouting at each other, or you're in this high intensity environment? And so it basically shuts down a person's critical thinking abilities. You're not able to stop and say, wait a minute, what is going on here? Because you're just wrapped up in this almost mob mentality of everybody engaging in whatever this physical exercise is. So the high arousal technique is one of the most powerful things.
What is up, everybody? My name is James D. Fiore, and this is Blackballed. That was the voice of my guest today. We have been covering the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church a lot on the Dean Blundell Network and on this show. And we've had ex-members. We've had our own takes on what the organization is. But I think it was time. And last week we were going to have her on, but she couldn't make it for that one. And we're glad that we have her today because we really need the expertise of somebody who actually knows these types of organizations, cults, inside and out. And the name that kept on coming up when I was doing my due diligence and when other people were advising me was this person. Her name is Dr. Janja Lalich. Is that right?
Janja. It's like Tanya, only Janja.
Janja. You know, I even practiced it, guys, before I came on here. That's how bad I am. That's how white I am, I guess.
It's not an easy name.
No, but still, thank you for coming on the show. Like I said in the intro, we really kind of are desperate for somebody who is an expert on this stuff, because as much as we like to rail against certain organizations that use religion especially as a sort of weapon in order to keep the flock sort of in check, we realize, at least I realize, that there is no replacement for someone like yourself who actually has an expertise in this. And so we were really thankful to have you. Can you give me like a kind of, quick sort of concise version of how it was that you got involved in this kind of work, starting with the Democratic, what is it called? The Democratic Workers Party, I think, that you were involved in, which was, I guess, a cult in hindsight, or while you were still there. Can you just give us a little bit of background on that?
Sure. When I was 30 years old, I joined a political cult. It was left wing. We were going to, make the revolution. I had just moved back to America after living in Spain for 4 years. And so I was new in town and making new friends. And I got invited by one of their front groups to join a study group. Anyway, from there, I got recruited into the background organization. And obviously, I didn't know it was a cult. I thought I had really found meaning and purpose and a really serious group of people. But in fact, for me, for all of us, it was 10 and a half years of absolute brutal, nonstop work, 18 hours a day, lots of sitting around in circles and criticizing each other. Everything was done just to pump up the reputation of our leader. And eventually, after 10 and a half years, we had our revolution and we overthrew our leader, which is quite unheard of in the world of cults.
Wow.
And that's how I got out. And then from that, I got my brain back together and then started studying and writing and went on to grad school to get my PhD. And here I am today.
Is that a typical type of cult? Like I always think of cults as like the spiritual side is a prerequisite, but that doesn't sound like it's necessarily true, is it?
No, a cult can have any ideology. It doesn't really matter what the belief system is. I mean, the belief system is basically kind of used as the glue to hold things together. But there's therapy cults, and there's UFO cults, and there's martial arts cults, and there's probably a chocolate chip cookie cult. I mean, there's absolutely every imaginable kind of organization, because it depends on the structure and the role of the authoritarian leader.
And so the Democratic Workers' Party was a radical Marxist-Leninist group.
Yes.
And so what was the, like, I don't even know how to ask this. I don't even know what question to ask. What was the main thrust of this leader's purpose, stated purpose? Was it to become, for America to become a communist state? Like, what was the grand idea?
I mean, well, the grand idea was to eventually become a socialist state. But in the beginning, she kind of intimated that this revolution was going to happen soon. But then that kind of changed over the first couple of years. And then it was like, this is something that isn't going to happen in our lifetime, but we're martyrs for the cause. So our role is to educate the masses and organize the masses. And at some point, all these various leftist organizations will band together and have this great revolution, but it'll be way after our time. So because we were martyrs, we were willing to give our lives. I mean, this is how we were trained to be. And it was not a happy life.
You said she. Is that rare for a woman to be the leader of a cult?
I wouldn't say it's rare. I would say men are in the majority. And I think that just has something to do with, unfortunately, how men are often raised in our society to think they're superior. But there are plenty of female cult leaders, yes.
As soon as a man gets married, he realizes he's not superior. I don't know if you knew that.
Not every man, apparently. Not the ones in Plymouth Brethren.
Yeah, right. Well, that's a good segue, actually, because as you know, we have had two specific we've had two ex-members, of the Plymouth Brethren Christian call. And I keep on saying Plymouth Brethren Christian Church because Richard told me something that there is sort of like offset groups that aren't as radical that are called like the Plymouth Brethren Church. And apparently they're two different things.
Right.
Yeah. So I don't want to be disrespectful to the totally normal isolated Christian groups. So I want to be as nice as I can. But so we've had Richard Marsh and we've had Cheryl Hope, and they've had totally different circumstances, but the heinousness that they experienced were both inside the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church. You watched the last podcast that we did, and you've done a little bit of research yourself. What is your take? I'm going to bring Richard in a moment, but I'm just wondering, like, just as a person who was not involved in the organization, what is your overall take on what this organization is like?
Well, first of all, I've known about the Plymouth Brethren for many years. I've had people contact, I've been doing this work for 30 some years now. So I've had people contact me in the past. And I actually wrote a book called Escaping Utopia, Growing Up in a Cult, Getting Out and Starting Over. And some of the people I interviewed for that book were exclusive brethren in the UK, which is one of the offshoots that goes back to the 1800s. Right. And I've actually had clients also, people who came to me for consultations who were raised in the Plymouth Brethren in Canada. So I don't know if it was the same one. And I don't know if Cheryl and Richard were in the same church, the same location. But yeah, it's for a long time, it has been identified as probably the most extreme of all of the offshoots that happened because of schisms that happened over time since the mid 1800s. And the Plymouth Brethren, both in other countries and in America and in Canada, are known to be the most extreme and the most doctrinaire, let's say.
When I first heard of, when I first started talking to Richard specifically, I kept on thinking of Scientology. Like, it's all I thought about, because in his specific case, and I'm gonna bring him in right after this question. His specific case, it was like, they basically hunted him down. They tried to hire, people to like find him and hold him and hand him over to them as if they're some sort of authority.
When he left.
Yes, and I'll let Richard speak for himself, but in just a nutshell version of it is that he blew the whistle on something, and then he became persona non grata. If the Plymouth Brethren specifically, you need to be born into it.
Yes, they don't recruit.
Yeah, what is like? It seems like that is a massive characteristic difference between maybe a cult like you were in and the Plymouth Brethren. Like, to be born into an organization like that is almost impossible to escape from, isn't it?
It's very, very difficult. I mean, I've worked with a number of people who were born in, a variety of groups, the Children of God, Scientology, as you mentioned, many, many other groups. And when you get into second and third and fourth generation, it's extremely difficult. And for the children, obviously, they didn't make it. It's one thing. I was 30. I was an adult. I joined. I have to take responsibility for that. Yes, I was deceptively recruited, but I joined. I was an adult. But for kids, that's all they know. It's their entire world. And then depending on how that particular cult deals with children, their lives are going to be marked in very deep and intense ways because, typically a child should have loving parents, be raised in a healthy environment, have other relatives around, et cetera, et cetera. And kids in cults don't get to experience any kind of independence or autonomy or the typical stages of childhood development.
Yeah, maybe that's a good time to bring in Richard. Richard March, welcome to Blackballed. Good to see you again, buddy.
Thank you. Yeah.
You were a kid in a cult. You were a kid born in a cult. What Dr. Lalich is saying makes a lot of sense to me as a total outsider that's never been in a cult except for the fact that I was Catholic when I grew up, but that's an accepted cult, I would say. I used to lie in confession, so that was fun.
I don't go there.
I used to lie in confession, and then the next month,
lying. So there you go.
Well, the next month I would go there and I'd be like, Father Murphy, it's been a month since my last confession. These are my sins. Most of the sins I told you last time I was in this booth were complete lies, and I feel like I've already said my Hail Marys, so let's split the difference and let me go. But it still felt like a cult on the surface. Sorry for the segue or for the trail off. Richard, give me an idea of what it's like to be a child in that environment in hindsight, because I know that when you're there and the indoctrination is from the day you were born, it's really hard to know. You don't know anything else, right?
Yeah, exactly. You don't know anything else, and also, I was a generation that went to a normal school. I went to ordinary public school as a child, and that brought all kinds of additional misery on my head because, of course, you were immediately perceived by the other children as being very different. You didn't have radio, you didn't have television, you had to sit out of religious assemblies, you had to sit out of sex education, you had to sit out of all the Christmas events. So you were kind of persecuted by the other children, and children can be cruel and thoughtless because of that. So that kind of all landed on top of the whole weird upbringing thing anyway. Mm-hmm. But in some ways, while the children in the Plymouth Brethren now have their own schools, so they don't get that same kind of bullying and sense of personal isolation, they're actually in a far worse state, because what I did learn through going to a regular school is I did make friends. There were people who were prepared to overlook my peculiarities. And I learned thereby that I was not special. I was not actually any different from them, that people outside in the world weren't actually all wicked, which of course stood me in good stead when I finally left, because although I was incredibly naive when I left, I wasn't nearly so naive as the current generation of brethren who have never had their beliefs challenged anywhere at any time, whatever, and genuinely think that everyone out there in the world has a black and wicked heart. And even if they try and show you kindness, it's purely the blood-stained hands of the devil trying to draw you into the wicked world. So I am thankful for the awful years of misery that was going to a non-brethren school, a real school, because it gave me some backbone, I think, and it also gave me an understanding that a deep understanding that was buried under the doctrine that people out there were exactly the same as I was.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that because even just a microcosmic example, like when you were talking about going to a public school and sort of being the odd man out, I remember going to mass with my class, and the one Jewish kid and then the one Jehovah's Witness kid wouldn't go up and get communion, and it was like every single time there was a bunch of us who were like felt sorry for him. There was a couple people that bullied them. There was but they were stared at, right? Like they were the others, and it just must have felt very strange for you.
Well, it's very bizarre because I remember distinctly in the UK, they always have a Christian assembly at the beginning of each school day. They don't do that here, which is actually a good thing, I believe. But because it was a Christian assembly, I had to sit outside the hall while the whole of the rest of the school was in the hall. And there were benches outside under the coat racks. And there were three people sitting there. There was me. I couldn't go in because I was brethren. There was a girl sitting there who was open brethren, who was another branch from the same original, brethren root. I couldn't, have communion with her or eat a meal with her because she was a different kind of brethren, but she equally couldn't join the school assembly. And then there was a lad my own age who was exclusive brethren, if you like, but he had been withdrawn from. The family had been withdrawn from. So I wasn't supposed to have anything to do with him either. So there were the three of us, not only separating from all the wicked children in the hall, but also separating from each other. And the three of us out there were all kind of different grades of brethren.
It's almost like Freemasons. You know how there's different levels, right? And you're supposed to only associate with people at your degree.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I don't know, but yeah, I'll believe you.
That's the only analogy that I'll come up with.
Yes.
Dr. Lalich, you said that it was one of the most extreme examples. What did you mean by that? And what is a less extreme example? Like, what has to happen for something to be considered the most extreme?
Well, I think they follow what they call the doctrine of separation. And that's exactly what Richard's been talking about. They stay as far away from other people as possible, people in the world, right? And they believe that the entire rest of the world is wicked, as he was just describing his experiences. That's far more extreme than, say, let's take the Jehovah's Witnesses, who at least they go out and stand on corners and knock on doors and try to talk to people.
They're social.
Yeah. At least they try to recruit. I mean, or other groups that, don't forbid the brethren. You're not allowed to eat with anyone who's not a brethren. So if you go into a restaurant and there's other people there, you won't eat in the same room with them. You can't go to other people's homes who aren't brethren. I mean, there's an incredible extreme isolation of that community, which is quite rare because it's not like they're living out in the middle of the nowhere. There are these churches in every urban area. I mean, there's at least 45,000 members worldwide, and they say there's 1,000 missionaries traveling around. But so that biblical literalism and the doctrinal purity is certainly one way that they are extreme, and just the treatment of women is pretty much like that in, I'd say, most fundamentalist cults or even fundamentalist churches. I think they're a little bit more extreme. The women have to sit in the back. The women actually can't even speak during the meetings. They have to go to meetings every single day of the week and something like 4 or 5 on Sunday. So there's just an absolute overdose, if you will, of the indoctrination that's just happening every single moment of your life. Whereas
Yeah.
other, most of them work for other brethren. So it's just, so if they leave, they lose everything. They're shunning, no one will ever talk to them again. They lose their families, they lose their job. It's very extreme.
Yeah, Richard, I mean, you said, was it last week, I think? You were talking about how the brethren where you were, I think it was in Cambridge, had access to one newspaper. But then you told me why, and I was like, oh, shit. It's just because I thought it was like, well, we would like to isolate them as much as possible, so only give them one media to look at. But that's not the reason at all, was it?
No, it was a strange kind of anomaly because the Brethren prophets, their leaders, over the years had always hated journalists. They said the man of sin would be a journalist and the media was wicked. And yet, curiously, they banned nearly everything, but they did let you have newspapers, not kind of tabloid newspapers, but respectable newspapers. And I figured out after I left that the reason for that was that the newspapers present an incredibly negative view of the world. So, if you came from another planet and you were to read a Toronto newspaper without having any knowledge, for example, of Toronto, it would have, accounts of rape. It would have accounts of people being shot. It would have a whole load of crime statistics. It would have a load of criticism of politicians. And so I realized that the newspapers, full of sin as they were, actually served the Brethren leadership very well in that they reinforced to the flock, as they call them, this idea that the world is a irredeemably wicked place and it's sinking lower every day. Now, of course, in reality, we know that it's just the nature of newspapers that they report a whole lot of crime, and Toronto is one of the safest and nicest places to live on the globe. And the chances of you actually getting shot in Toronto, unless you happen to be a drug gang member, is less than the chance of being hit by a meteorite, and certainly less than the chance of getting raped in the PBCC. But so that was, part of their strategy. It reinforced the lie they were putting out that the whole world was wicked.
Yeah, and that isolationism is weird too, because a person in your situation who left, and there's all these circumstances, of course, attached to why you left and everything. But the first time that I heard your story from you on an earlier podcast, I was heartbroken because of the impossible position that your family becomes in when they are still there, and how strange it is for me to hear you not nonchalantly, but almost like matter-of-factly state that it's not really the parents who are the number one and number two people in the kid's life. It is this entity known as the church. Yeah. And I was just stunned that leaders can have sway over the children of people that are members of the flock. And, since you've been gone, has there been any, do you ever get kind of lost in this perpetual strategic kind of mindset of how you can save them? Does that happen, or is it just almost an impossible situation?
Yeah, no, I definitely have a strategy to save them, but as I'm sure Janja will tell you, it's very, very difficult to drag someone out of a cult unless they come to their own convictions, and in fact, attempting to do so will tend to cause them to become more deeply embedded. So, for that reason, and people do find this hard to understand, I have never contacted my children and said to them, hey, this is a filthy, wicked cult and they're abusing you and they're using you, because it would actually drive them deeper in, and it would give the priests in there the opportunity to badmouth me and tell them a whole load more lies about me. So my strategy to get them out is not to kind of drill a hole in the wall and pull them through it. My strategy to get them out is to demolish the whole damn prison, and then they can climb out through the rubble.
Yeah, good
I
luck
love
with
that. Yeah.
And I mean, and he's right. You can't, people, it has to be there. Not that some people haven't had interventions and perhaps they worked, but even the people who did interventions don't do them in that same way anymore. And, I have this idea, I have this concept that, everybody who's in one of these organizations, a high control church, cult, whatever it is, business, whatever, they have doubts, but you can't express those doubts because there's no way to do that. You get punished, right? Or you see examples of other people who did and boom, you don't want to go there. So you keep piling these doubts on the back of your head, right? And then one day something happens, you either see something or you're asked to do something or you observe the leader lying or whatever, just one more thing, and that's going to break that shelf. Then at that moment, the person, they're not going to leave right then, but the person might start thinking, maybe this isn't healthy for me. Maybe this isn't the greatest, be all and end all in the world. And then they have to find their way out. And so what I always say to people on the outside is, be that safe haven. Don't spend your time confronting them and challenging them, but just be, let them know that you're that place. If they ever want to leave or change their mind or whatever, want a vacation, they can come to you. They can stay with you. You're not going to bug them. You're not going to question them. You're going to let them sleep or do whatever they want to do, because it's, Richard would know, it's one of the hardest things anyone can ever do, is because you're leaving your entire worldview, not to mention all your human connections. And that's a difficult step to take.
Richard?
The brethren have a strategy of mind control that's very, very potent, and that is, they tell you that God knows all your thoughts, everything you're thinking about, and they tell you to have a doubt is sin. And
Right.
so then, of course, you can't even let yourself think a doubt. You can't let yourself think a criticism, because immediately your conscience kicks in. And I don't know, I mean, and Janja can speak to this, exactly what the human conscience is. I mean, it's some evolutionary mechanism that tells us that some things are good to do and some things are bad to do. But the brethren in particular, and I suppose many religions to some extent, hijack that mental faculty we have, and they make you feel guilty about a whole range of things that just simply suits their agenda. One of the things they make you feel incredibly guilty about is doubting. Doubting is terrible, and they tell you that a wicked thought is a poison, and wicked actions spring from wicked thoughts, and so you talk about critical thinking, but you never even start down that road.
Right.
If you did start down that road, you would very, very quickly see through the whole thing. But mentally, you're mentally blocked from starting down that pathway, which is why it's so very, very difficult. It's why it's so pointless to try and engage these persons in a conversation, because they will literally block their ears and turn their back on you because they feel it's sinful even to listen to you.
Right. My sister used to do that when she was a kid.
No, I've witnessed it. I witnessed my own cousin in his 20s standing on the street, and someone was questioning him about his beliefs, and he was literally putting his hands over his ears and turning his back. And then he would whip round to make another remark, and then he would slam his hands over his ears and turn his back again. I mean, he looked a complete idiot. But I mean, that's the mentality.
I mean, I think what a lot of people, I think, don't understand is what indoctrination is and how it works. And it's one reason I don't use the term mind control, because I feel that it's a very kind of mechanical term, and it's not really scientifically based. But essentially what cults are doing is setting up this structure with this, so-called infallible leader who can never be challenged, who's all powerful. They have this extremist doctrine, which is an all or nothing belief system. And by the fact that it's all or nothing means that the ends justify the means, which means you can be asked to do anything and it's for the greater good or your salvation or whatever it is they're telling you. And then there are these interlocking, what I call systems of influence and systems of control. So the controls are the really obvious things, like in this group, the rules about eating, the rules about clothes, the rules about women doing this, all of the really overt stuff that's obvious, how many children to have, all of that. But the social psychological influences, in fact, I believe are much more powerful and go much deeper, because that's where they're preying on your emotions, and that's where they're attacking yourself. And the goal of the indoctrination system is to take apart yourself and recreate a new self in the image that the cult wants you to be. Wow. So for children, obviously, this happens from birth. They don't even have to go after attacking the old self. But children also are rebellious just naturally. And so there are going to be times when children have to be, taken to task, punished, beaten, whatever it is in whatever group. But this attacking the self, where you then are doubting everything you believed before, you lose your sense of self-trust and self-confidence, and more over time you become completely dependent on the leader, particularly, and the group. And for families, in a cult there can only be one loyalty, and that's to the leader. Mm-hmm. And that includes parents and children. And that's why I think people on the outside find it so, unimaginable that, someone in a cult could let their child die, which happens all the time because they're praying instead of helping the child or whatever it might be. But your only loyalty is to the leader. And in many cults, families are even broken up. The actual biological parents don't even raise the kids. So by tearing apart yourself, you get to this place in your mind that I call bounded choice. And what that means is that you have completely internalized the ideology and the beliefs and the behaviors and the thoughts. And at that point, you absolutely cannot imagine life outside the group. Life outside the group equals death, either literal or metaphorical. And so it's just as Richard was saying, you can't even entertain those thoughts. The minute you start doing it, you beat yourself. You don't even need someone else to hold you accountable anymore. Right. And when you get to that state, yes, you have free will, because this always comes up, especially in court cases. But as I see it, your free will is altered by the will of the leader. And so your choices are constrained by that environment. And that's why it's hard for people to leave. And that's why I think it's hard for people on the outside to understand what it is to experience that.
I'm just curious, as you're talking there, I just thought of something, and I'm just wondering, are Western democracies these like robust petri dishes for cults to flourish because of things like privacy laws? No, really, because of things like privacy laws and freedom of religion and things like that. Like, how would a court system how could conceivably, just theoretically, a court system be used to try to break an organization like what you described as being one of the most dangerous Christian cults in the world?
Right. So if a cult declares itself a religion, for example, in America, it's really easy to become a religion. I think you fill out a couple of forms and you say you have a couple of followers, and voila, you're a religion. I always thought about trying to do it with my dog and my cat as my followers. But anyway, so once you're a religion, at least in America, nobody's going to touch you with a 10-foot pole. So in order to hold cults and cult leaders accountable, you have to go after whatever criminal activity they're engaged in. And then you can take them to court. If there's sexual abuse, if there's sexual abuse of minors, if there's tax evasion, if there's medical malpractice, if there's, take the example of NXIVM. The people probably remember the cult in New York that's been known as the sex cult. They got that leader on 7 federal charges of things like sex trafficking, child pornography, money laundering, et cetera, et cetera. It was like, they saw it as a criminal organization, and it was. And he got a sentence of 120 years Now, there are still some believers, a small, tiny group of believers who still believe in him and are trying to carry on, but they're pretty much, you know, of no significance. And everyone else is able to get out and hopefully are getting some recompense because there's also a civil suit. So they have to commit crimes, and most of them do. And you have to have evidence of those crimes in order to try to hold them accountable. The rub is, more often than not, law enforcement, especially if you go to law enforcement, I had a case where a husband, his wife was giving away hundreds of thousands of dollars to some buddy energy worker who was every minute of it. He went to the police and said, you know, my wife's being hornswoggled by this guy. He's, you know, she's given him hundreds of thousands of our money. And the cop said, well, she's an adult. She's 40 years old. You know, she's doing it of her own free will. So until we can get the courts to understand this concept of coercion, and coercive influence and coercive control, that's going to help open up holding these leaders accountable.
And that's sort of what I was thinking about. That, you know, like I don't know. I mean, it sounds like fraud. It sounds like a whole bunch of different things. This manipulative, tactic that they take. And I know, Richard, like, I don't want to belabor the point, but the excommunicated or the escapees or whatever you want to call an ex-member like yourself, the determination to destroy those people is both confusing to me. And yet still unsurprising. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, why are they? I mean, your case is kind of a special one, but like just in general, just the idea, like, why do they want to chase these people? Is it to set the example for the ones that are still there? Like, why do they care so much?
Well, I mean, in my case, it's because I knew too much. And I think really in all the cases, it's because people know too much. I mean, look at Cheryl Hope's case, how much she knew, how damning it's going to be, how devastating that's going to be for the church. But it's even if people maybe don't have a specific story of crime or criminal activity in the church, they will still chase them down to make an example of them, because what the church doesn't want to happen is that anyone leaves and is seen to succeed. Because they need to continue to prop up the lie that if you leave, you will fail, you will go to the wall, you'll end up in the gutter, you'll die of some horrible disease. Exactly. And so they want you to fail. They'll make you fail. If you have a business, they'll interfere with your business to try and drag it down. They have this faith, they call it a faith, but actually the stuff they say is going to happen doesn't happen. So then they have to make it happen.
Yeah.
And it's the same with the politics. If there's a God that listens to their prayers, why do they need to interfere in politics? Why not just pray about it? I mean, it's they're kind of trying to make up for the deficiencies of their God, who doesn't always do what they say he's going to do. And that way they lose credibility.
Right.
But I mean, it's also, I've been thinking recently, there's so many ex-brethren that have been followed around by private investigators. And in many cases, it's very obvious. These private investigators are not hiding themselves. They're very bold. And I realized that actually they want you to see the private investigators. They want you to know you're being stalked, because that's the intimidation. It's not actually that they want to investigate you or know anything about you. They want you to know that we're watching you, and that we know where you are. And if you speak out, we'll know where to come and get you.
Yeah.
Very aggressive.
Sorry, go ahead, Dr. Lalich.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, this is why I said earlier, this is one of the more extreme, because most groups, when you leave, they'll let you leave. You leave. They may badmouth you within the group. They may, cut off your family and all your relationships with anyone in the cult. But very few cults actually go after people. My cult did sometimes, especially if the person knew a lot and they wanted to make sure to shut you up. we know other groups that do that to some degree, but this is extreme, even for cults.
Yeah.
And I'd like to ask Richard,
Yeah.
is it only the one there in your community, or do the Plymouth Brethren, are there other extreme churches as extreme in other parts of the world in terms of going after people?
I don't know. I mean, and as you were kind of bringing out, the nomenclature, if that's the word, of the brethren is complicated.
Yes.
And the reason for that is that until about 2014, 2012, the brethren insisted on being non-denominational. It was actually foundational to their religion that they wouldn't take a name, because to take an earthly name means you're no longer a heavenly church. And they despised every other sect of Christianity because they took a name, which made it very difficult for anyone to kind of hold them to account, because they had no name. And we were brought up that if anyone asks you, what your faith is, you were to say, we're just simple Christians and believers on the Lord Jesus. You must never, ever, you were Plymouth Brethren, because that's just what outsiders invented. And
Right.
then they go on.
I was just going to say, there's another very large fundamentalist cult that doesn't take a name either. They say it's against God to take a name, but they're known as the 2x2s. And I don't know if you've heard of them.
Yes,
they're in Australia, New Zealand. They're here. They're hundreds of thousands of members, and they're very secretive. They only meet in houses. They don't have churches. They don't recruit. Same type of thing. And I know quite a few people who were born into that. And
Is that a Noah's Ark reference?
the 2x2s, it could be. I mean, it is. When they do go out, they go out in twos. Like two men who are called workers will go out. And I'm not sure that they don't really recruit, so I'm not sure what they exactly do. But and it's the same thing. They don't have like a pastor. They have just elders. It's very, very similar. In fact, some of the articles and your former podcast, the first podcast, I sent to someone I know who was born in the 2x2s. I said, you're going to be blown away by the similarities.
I think probably the biggest difference between the brethren and the 2x2s is that the 2x2s don't have this huge emphasis on financial prosperity, I suspect.
Not for the members, but there's a lot of money. Everybody turns over their money. So
I see. All goes to the top.
It's very secretive about where the money goes.
Is that one of those constant things that these characteristics among cults? Is it, at the end of the day, if you look behind the curtain, is it really about leadership's greed more than anything else? Or is it like, is there a psychological profile of a cult leader, and does it often include money?
Yeah, well, I would say, excuse me, most cult leaders are narcissists, and most often fit the definition of a malignant narcissist, which means that they have some traits of psychopathy or sociopathy, which is when things can get really nasty. But they're narcissists. It's all about them. It's all about whatever serves their needs. And it almost always seems to revolve around money, sex, and of course, power. I mean, power is a given, but financial exploitation and sexual exploitation, I swear, turns up in almost every cult, whether it's led by a woman or a man.
Can't they just go to Vegas?
The leaders of Heaven's Gate did go to Vegas.
That's right. That's
Well,
the
well,
Heaven's
they
Gate.
do,
I
but
did.
they need the money to go there. That's the thing. I mean, we were tracking Bruce Hale's jet. You remember there was a fuss because someone was tracking Elon Musk's jet and he didn't like it. We found the same kind of methodology and managed to track Bruce Hale's jet, which he had taken off the standard tracking systems. And damn me, if like 4 months ago, his jet suddenly disappears out of Australia in the middle of, while everything else was still locked down, and makes a beeline for Vegas. And we published, and then it pops off to Puerto Rico, some very nice resort there for a few days. And
Where they also have
went back to Australia.
Yeah.
But meanwhile, his followers are not allowed to go into a restaurant.
Right.
And
And I mean,
get
it's like
corrupted in McDonald's. I mean,
it's like Bhagwan Rajneesh, he had his 93 Rolls Royces, and every day he would pick a different Rolls Royce and drive down the long road on their property in Oregon. And all the followers would stand there in their orange robes, like throwing roses at the car and crying as he drove by. I mean, who needs 93 Rolls Royces? I mean, it's just obscene.
yes,
Yeah,
there's no limit to their ambition. I mean, they're never happy with what they've got. I
Exactly.
mean, the same, I suppose, with a lot of billionaires and billionaires and businessmen. They work their fingers to the bone until they die to make another billion, and don't get a chance to enjoy it because it's actually the making money that is the incentive.
Yeah.
And just the power, the power though, like I know a guy, his mom who passed away. She was a really nice lady, but she had Parkinson's disease, and it turns out she gave like 75 grand a year to Benny Hinn.
Mm.
And I'm just like, I'm so confused why modern laws have not caught up to that type of manipulation and behavior and the ability to extract money from people by preying on in this case, their literal sense of survival. If I pay this man money, Jesus might save me. Why isn't that a crime? Like
Freedom of religion, at least in America, freedom of religion.
Yeah, here too.
I mean, that's what's scary. I mean, bringing it up to date with Poilievre, who's the sort of now uncontested Conservative leadership candidate, he's banging this freedom of religion drum. Well, thank you, we have freedom of religion. What he actually means is that weird religious cults should be allowed to do obscene and unpleasant things without the government daring to intervene. We need just a little bit less freedom of religion. Thank you very much.
And for us here, it's, freedom of religion means imposing your religious values on the rest of us.
Yes. Freedom to impose.
Now the Supreme Court is a cult. It seems like,
Certainly ideological.
Yeah. And so it feels like there's no solution though. That's the frustrating part. Like the individual inside the cult, it's really up to them, right? Like aside from the criminal charges that you could pursue if you can find any. Is that sort of the tragedy of it, or?
Yeah, the tragedy of it is there are just thousands and thousands, millions probably, of people in cults and thousands who've left. I mean, I've been teaching these courses on Zoom, recovery courses for survivors of cults and other kinds of abusive situations. But, I'm here in America. We've had people from Canada, of course, from Holland, from Sweden, from Mexico, from Spain, from Norway, from England. I mean, is from Slovenia. I mean, there is such a demand for help for people when they get out of these groups, and for people to not stigmatize them. Oh, you stupid person, you joined a cult. But yeah, I think this is a problem we're always going to have. And the most we can do, I think, is some kind of broad-based education so people understand better how not to be taken advantage of.
And I remember thinking that the Trump base felt cultish to me. And I know there's probably varying degrees of what cults are. So, I mean, but you had your figurehead, all powerful. He could do no wrong and say no wrong. And people got really lost in that. And I was confused, but I was fascinated for one thing, because I was like, how can this self-evident rodeo clown dipshit actually mobilize millions of people? How is this possible? And I don't really know the answer to that still. But in Canada, because of what's, we've been working, we're like the only outlet really that's even talking about this group right now. And there might be one other. And, but I'm not going to let go of it because I share Richard's penchant for destroying it, right? I really want to, right, with the truth, by the way, too. But I want to go back again to what you said about how it is like a really dangerous, or the most dangerous Christian kind of offshoot cult. And then I wrote this, Stephen Harper Pierre Poilievre and the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church. That is our prime minister in 2006 swearing on a Plymouth Brethren Bible when he was sworn into office. And the group is tied into politics so deeply that even the prime minister's former personal attorney is the general counsel for the cult.
Wow.
How, I mean, does this happen in other countries? Like, does the United States have a problem with Scientologists funding politics? Is this rare? Like, or do you even know the answer to that question? I'm asking Dr. Lalich. Yeah.
Churches aren't supposed to get involved in political causes. And that's one of the things that could be a violation. It's one of the things a lot of people here scream about, because of course they do. But what what it can lead to, of course, is where you have people like Hitler and Kim Jong-un in North Korea and Chairman Mao in China, where you have entire nations that become cults in a sense, because of the power of who's heading the country. And Chairman Mao, and certainly in Russia and all those communist countries, were indoctrinating people like crazy. It's basically the same kind of stuff that goes on in the cults today, same type of thought reform. And when they get their fingers or nails or whatever it is that they get into politics, that's a problem. And Canada's not a big country, so I think it could be concerning for you. The extent, I read that article and I was pretty much horrified. I was like, whoa, this is way more than I was aware of.
Well, me too. Richard is sort of the horn of plenty when it comes to fucked up shit that the cult does, right? To pardon my French, but and Richard, this is a mainstay for the Plymouth Brethren, right? Like every country that they operate in, they tether together their interest with political interest and then feed their own businesses, basically. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they've always been in. Well, I say always, since Bruce Hales, the current incumbent. Prophet, man of God, elect vessel, whatever you want to call him. We call him the Mog. Since he got in, he really ramped up the political. I mean, they used to be interested in politics when I was a kid in the sense of they would, when an election came up, they would all be praying about it, that some godly, God-fearing person might get in. But when I was a child, they were never actually really engaging with politicians, except occasionally if there was some matter that affected them, like trade unions membership. They were concerned about because it was against their religion to be a member of a trades union, so they wanted an exception for Brethren members so they didn't have to join. So they would make representation to government about that, which was fairly harmless. But since Bruce Hales got in, it's aggressive political campaigning. I mean, they're going out on the street. They'll dress up with masks on. I mean, in Tasmania, they had a campaign against the Green Party, which they hated, and they're actually driving like a float through the streets with Brethren members wearing pig masks and shouting slogans and the most aggressive, loud political campaighning, and it always comes back and bites them on the bum, but they just carry on.
I've seen that Hales guy before. You sure it just wasn't his face?
Well, yeah, it could be. Maybe they were just wearing leader masks. I don't know, but I mean, pigs are nice. I like pigs.
Richard, is Bruce Hales? That's his name. Yes.
Yes.
Is he the Mog of all of the Plymouth Brethren churches around the world?
Absolutely. It's highly centralized. I mean, it's incredibly centrally controlled. I mean, it says on their website they have 300 autonomous assemblies, and when you read autonomous, you just roll over on the floor laughing because everything is no one in the church can get married. None of those 55,000 people can marry without his specific permission and blessing. You can't move to a different city without his specific permission and blessing. It's incredibly tight control. And I mean,
he must be really busy.
Yeah,
very busy. Well, I mean, he's got a little clique. He's got 3 of his sons and 1 of his sons-in-law, which are like the sort of
because usually the cult leaders don't do very much. They're usually pretty lazy.
Well, yeah, no, I don't know whether he's semi-retired and his sons run it, but there's this dark black hole, and it's the clique, and it's these five people. But normally it all comes from the Mog himself, and I expect he delegates it to his son. But he doesn't trust anyone outside his family with anything serious, so it's incredibly tightly controlled.
We have about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to ask this to both of you. Dr. Lalich, maybe you can go first. You saw the podcast with Cheryl Hope, one of the bravest women I think I've ever met, at least met in the digital sense. Like I considered her to be a friend because of all the stuff that we've sort of like gone through together in a sense. Obviously her a lot more than me. When a person escapes and they've experienced that kind of heinous abuse, is there a process for them that is just entirely different than another type of victim who was not in a cult but was able to get away from their situation? Is it a double whammy for them? Is it a mental, emotional, physical, all that? Like, how does the difference work? And what would you recommend to the people who, because it sounds like there's going to be a few more people who are going to be escaping probably in the next little while because of the bravery that Cheryl showed. So is there any advice that you could give to people that may be watching, that may be thinking about that, or what to do after they leave?
Sure. And I also want to mention there's a cult in Edmonton where pretty much the same thing is happening. It's I think about 70 people have left so far out of about 400. So, and it's because a woman came forward with her story of sexual abuse by the leader. Anyway, the kind of trauma that's experienced in cults is not your typical PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. It's what we call complex PTSD because it's relational, right? It means that it's something that happened to you or that you witnessed and that it went on for a longer period of time. It wasn't just like one car accident or your house burned down and that was traumatic and, things like that. So complex PTSD, unfortunately, is not yet recognized by the American Psychiatric Association, which is completely crazy. People have been trying to get that changed for decades now, but I think most people, certainly like me in the field who are cult aware, understand it and understand the difference in the symptoms. And actually the courses that I've been doing, we're also training therapists so that more therapists understand how to work with these kind of clients. So the thing to do is kind of just, take time, debrief, rest, relax. I hate to mention my own book, but I will. But my book, Take Back Your Life, Recovering from Cults and Abusive Relationship, has been around for quite a while now. It's very, very helpful to many people. And also, I mentioned earlier, my book, Escaping Utopia, especially if you were born in the group. And the best thing is to try to find some kind of counselor or therapist who is aware of this kind of trauma or who is at least willing to learn about it. And perhaps find some kind of support group of other former members, not necessarily of your group, but of other groups. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So that
was an on-the-fly plug, everybody. But go ahead.
So yeah, I think that the best thing is to give yourself time. It takes time, and not pressure yourself, and not compare yourself to anyone else. So and so's so much better recovered than I am. We each have our own journey.
Yeah. And Richard, other than gasoline and matches, which I'm totally down for, as a person who's
on this podcast.
I'm sorry. I'm just joking. I'm just kidding. I would never burn down that many churches. I swear to you. Just kidding. Richard, as a person who has escaped and as a person who's been there, communicating with Cheryl and other people who have escaped with that Facebook group that you guys, I love that group, by the way. I think it's, you know what's really hilarious about that group, actually? Ex-members are funny. They're funny people. Like they like maybe that's part of the coping mechanism is to sort of see humor and stuff. But Richard, what advice would you give, or what do you know that you could sort of share with us that works for people when they do leave?
Well, I think the hardest thing for me, and probably one of the hardest things for people leaving the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church, is that they instill in you as part of their doctrine a sense of self-hatred.
Mhm.
and absolute negation of any self-worth, which is extremely difficult to overcome, and it makes it very hard to, particularly in the first couple of years, it's very, very hard to even believe that that you will get better, that you will get beyond it. And you have to learn to love yourself. And,
Mhm.
and that's a blasphemy inside the church. Talk about loving yourself inside the church would be a terrible, blasphemous thing to say, because you're supposed to hate yourself.
Right.
And so you have to be, I mean, when I left the church, I went round, when I left the cult, I went round a few conventional churches more out of curiosity, just to see what they were like. And I went into a Catholic church in Norwich, UK, and it was a very odd experience. But there were these there was a priest there who was preaching, and he was wearing bright green robes. I think he was Brazilian. He was very nice chap. And I really didn't expect to get help from a Catholic priest of all people. Uh, but he gets up, and I was expecting some sort of exposition of scripture and so on. And he says, and he was just talking about, be good to yourself, be a
Mhm.
little kind to yourself. Don't be too hard on yourself. And that was actually a bit of a light bulb moment to me, because I was still in the mindset and the
Mhm.
mental frame of, you have to work incredibly hard and you'll never be good enough and you're a wretched, wicked person. And I think I kind of took that on, and I started being a little kind to myself, and just doing
Yeah,
things because I felt
good.
like doing them, and not feeling guilty about going to the pub and having a nice steak and chips just because I felt like doing that. And I think that's
There's
where
an interesting
it
irony.
started. Yeah.
There's an interesting irony in that, because and I was just talking about this with my sister not too long ago, about how I live in the country now. Like I lived in Toronto my whole life, and every time I took my kids with my wife to swimming lessons, we have to pass by this one property that has this gigantic crucifix
Mm.
on the lawn. And when you're talking to me about going to a Catholic church and sort of sitting in and then talking to a priest, and my brain is just thinking about the man. Like, I find it very strange that we live in a world where an iconic image of a man who's got nails through his wrist bones and ankles, with a big cut on his side and cuts all over his head, tortured basically, is like a symbol of salvation. And then during the actual mass, cannibalism, the Eucharist, and so it's. I feel like that is a cult. Like, I feel like all of it are cults. Religion itself, Catholicism, evangelicalism, dominionists, you name it, cult. And I know that they're not as serious and stuff, but I find it interesting that you saw, like, there was solace that you legitimately found, and good for you. But in the place that wasn't as bad as your place, but still has cannibalism and tortured men as their mainstays. Do you find that odd?
Well, it was odd, and as I said, it wasn't the place I was expecting to get help. I went there out of curiosity,
Mm-hmm.
but it was just. I mean, I suppose in this day and age, pastors and priests and people in sort of respectable, organized religion are actually trained to some extent in psychology and how to care for traumatized people, and how to actually care for people quite apart from their religious belief. And of course, the priests in the exclusive Brethren, Plymouth Brethren Christian Church, are not trained in any of that. I mean, they will be going off with, your teenage daughter has had some kind of liaison with some young brother, um, you know, and of course, that's huge issue. And so a couple of priests will turn up at your house in the evening, and they'll take your daughter off in a car, to probably a lay-by, or probably their business premises, which is all closed down and quiet. And they'll take her off for a couple of hours, and they'll be grilling her about her, sexual experimentation, perfectly innocent stuff that everyone would do, except, of course, in the Brethren, you're not allowed to do that. And these people, I mean, not only are they basically sexually frustrated middle-aged males, but they have absolutely zero training at all in psychology or child psychology or basic pastoral care or anything of that nature. They're just the guys who happen to rise to the top in the kind of scrum that's the Plymouth Brethren, because it's unstructured. There's no theological college, there's no training, there's nothing. And so basically it's the most nasty and ambitious people that rise to the top. And these are the people who are taking care that they'll take your children out of your own house, they'll grill them about their sexual experimentation or whatever you want to call it for 2 hours in some remote business premises, and then about midnight they get dropped off back home.
Yeah,
time and time and time again in my household. And you never think, because you're so indoctrinated that this is the way things happen, you never think, well, my daughters might be in danger from these people. Maybe these people are, it's an incredibly exposed position. And yet you never even think that, this is wrong. And yet anyone else, any regular person in the world, if a couple of guys turn up and want to take your daughter off to their business premises and talk to her about sex for 2 hours,
over my dead body.
Go with that. But this happens today, this evening. Probably hundreds of young brethren, girls and boys are being grilled by middle-aged or to elderly male priests in remote locations away from their parents all around the globe. And then you wonder why there's sexual exploitation going on in the church.
Well, listen, maybe one of the positive ancillary benefits of living in a newly woke world is that the misogyny and the sexism that clearly permeates in these organizations and these chapters will be called out, at least. Like, I don't even know. Like, I'm totally at a loss as to how we are going to successfully destroy this organization. I'm very much hopeful that we can. But you know what I'm saying? Like, it's clearly... like I find that in a lot of religions. I find, and I'm not afraid to say that to criticize certain religions. So like Islam and Catholicism and all and certain Orthodox Jewish religions, like it's grounded fundamentally. It's anchored in misogyny, like in a male lack of like they just feel insecure to the point where they create systems to make sure that women don't do anything that might impact their sensibilities or their possessiveness. And it's like, and when it's obvious like this, I don't know why there isn't some sort of societal remedy. I guess maybe I'm too idealistic. I don't know. We'll leave it there. There was no question. But listen, I appreciate you guys very much for coming on, because that was very educational for me. Dr. Lalich, I'd love to have you come back and talk further about this kind of stuff. Richard, I'll probably talk to you tonight on the telephone, since we gab a lot like a couple of school chumps. So I'm looking forward to that. Thank you very much for joining us, guys. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. Enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. That was Dr. Janja Lalich and Richard Marsh. I learned a lot. Left the episode feeling frustrated that it doesn't feel like there's very many solutions that we can find and implement, because we have this awesome freedom of religion and privacy laws in our society that seems to enable these groups. That's one of the main lessons that I feel like I'm walking away with, like the seemingly legal way that they operate. Obviously aside from the abuse and all that, but the brainwashing, the indoctrination, perfectly legal. Buyer beware, I guess. Anyways, I'm really thankful to my guests again, Richard Marsh and Dr. Janja Lalich, and we will see you next time on Blackballed.
Blackballed. Blackballed. Blackballed. Blackballed. Blackballed.